Hello, and welcome to the afternoon keynote session, Managing the Fatigue Factor in Children with Hearing Loss. It's a very timely topic and one I know I'm looking forward to hearing more about. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of things that you've been hearing all day long. Remember to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. If you need translation, interpretation, those buttons are to the right as well. If you are earning CEUs or wish to earn CEUs for the sessions, please be sure to complete the learning grid when you finish the session, and please stay for the entire session to get that full CEU credit. I'm honored to introduce two professionals from Vanderbilt University. Ben Hornsby is Associate Professor in the School of Medicine. He focuses his research on hearing loss related communication difficulties and the impact on quality of life in adults and children with hearing loss. It's a really important topic for us. His current research examines relationships between hearing loss, mental effort, and fatigue. Hilary Davis is a pediatric and educational audiologist at Vanderbilt Bill Wilkinson Center. She provides consultative educational audiology support to local school districts in the Nashville area. She has also partnered with researchers in the Listening and Learning Lab to assess listening-related fatigue in school-aged children with hearing loss. She uses the Vanderbilt fatigue scales in school evaluations to support the students she serves. Thank you for being here, Ben and Hilary, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joni. I appreciate that. To the audience, I can't see you, so it's a little weird. I'm kind of looking out my window and at a camera, but I appreciate you all being here, and I also appreciate the organizing committee inviting Dr. Davis and I to speak to you today about some of the work we've been doing over the past couple of years at Vanderbilt, looking at the issue of listening-related fatigue in children with hearing loss. When I give these kinds of talks, I like to start off to sort of introduce to people why we think this is an important issue for kids with hearing loss. And I think the children themselves do a nice job of highlighting the potential importance for fatigue in their lives. And on the slide that you're looking at now, there's a couple of quotes from kids with hearing loss that we collected during focus groups and interviews that we conducted, trying to better understand the fatigue experience of these kids. And they do a nice job, I think, of highlighting the issues. For example, one child said, "My brain needs a rest from listening." Another, "The first thing I do when I get home is take my hearing aids out. I just need a break." And the last child said, "Trying harder to listen and understand drains me and makes me feel down." So some of you who work directly with kids with hearing loss, you probably have heard comments like this, certainly not from every child, but from some. And these quotes really highlight that fatigue is a complex construct, and it can express itself physically, in mentally, cognitive issues, or social and emotionally in kids. But these quotes really highlight that for some kids, at least, it can have a significant negative effect on their quality of life. And because of that, we think it's important. And if it's important, we think we ought to be able to measure it. Hopefully, if we can measure it well and reliably, then we can develop interventions that we might be able to use to try to help reduce the impact of fatigue. And those are the things that Dr. Davis and I will be talking with you about today. Before I get down to the details of our talk, I need to acknowledge that neither Hilary nor I have financial conflicts of interest with any of the things we'll be talking about today. The scales that we'll introduce to you are freely available for download. The work that we'll be talking about has been funded from a variety of both governmental and industry sources. And the other thing that we have to acknowledge is that while Hilary and I get to talk to you today about what we've been doing, we certainly wouldn't have anything to say if it wasn't for the significant contributions of many, many other people. And I've highlighted several here that have worked on a variety of projects in this area and that we're depending on for the information that we'll share with you today. I'd like to especially highlight Dr. Fred Bess, who was been interested in this area for many, many years, and it's really been a driving force in this research area. So this is what we'll try to cover today. I'll introduce the general construct of fatigue, why we think it's important, why we think people with hearing loss might be at increased risk for fatigue. And to do that, we'll talk about a current model of fatigue that we think is relevant. Introduce some data supporting the idea that children with hearing loss are more likely to experience problems with listening-related fatigue. And we'll talk about some generic tools that have been used in the past and are currently being used to measure and quantify those effects, and some of their limitations, which led us to develop our own scale, which is specifically designed to assess listening-related fatigue, targeting listening difficulties in children with hearing loss. That is the Vanderbilt fatigue scales. And Dr. Davis will talk to you about how you might be able to use those scales on a daily basis with the population that you work with. So first off, what is fatigue? Well, it's can be defined lots of different ways. The way that we're most interested in, what we'll be talking about today, is fatigue as a subjective construct, a feeling, a mood state, a feeling of tiredness, exhaustion, a lack of energy, reduced desire to keep on keeping on, doing some sort of task. If you're interested in the subjective experience of fatigue, then you'll measure it using questionnaires or survey measures. And I'll talk a little bit later about different factors that impact whether or not fatigue will develop and how severe it becomes. But one sort of universal factor that's almost always associated with fatigue is the application of effort. And if you don't apply effort towards something, whether it be physical or mental, you tend to not be fatigued. Well, if the effort that you're applying is devoted to some sort of listening task and fatigue develops, then we refer to that as listening-related fatigue. So it's just a type of fatigue. So who has fatigue? Well, if I could see you all in a crowd, I'd say raise your hand if you've ever been fatigued, and pretty much everybody would raise their hand because it's something that's ubiquitous. We all experience it to some degree or another at some point in our lives. But in a healthy population, the kind of fatigue that we typically experience is mild and transient in nature. You apply some effort towards a task, you get a little fatigue, you take a quick break or a rest, do something else, and the fatigue goes away, and it has very limited long-term effects on us. But that's not really the kind of fatigue that I'm talking about. The fatigue we're going to be talking about today is more severe in nature. It occurs more frequently than it does in a healthy population, and it can occur in response to situations or issues or challenges that don't lead to fatigue in a typical healthy population. Things like listening, right? Normally, we don't think of listening as leading to fatigue, but it certainly can. This kind of severe fatigue is not common in healthy populations, but it is common in populations who have some other health condition, chronic health condition, and I've listed a few here. Cancer, AIDS, Parkinson's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, and others. Some of these disease states, one of their primary complaints is our fatigue-like symptoms. And it turns out that recent evidence over the past few years from our lab and others suggests that people with hearing loss are also at risk for this type of severe recurrent fatigue. So why do we think that's important, that we need to look at it? I think some of the quotes that on that first slide that I showed you highlight, at least anecdotally, but there's evidence from the research literature. Much of it comes from research in children with other chronic health conditions, like I just mentioned. Looking at fatigue in children with hearing loss is relatively, there's limited work in that area. It's just really starting to gain momentum. But from the related research literature, we find that children who suffer from severe recurrent fatigue tend to have trouble maintaining their focus and attention. They're more easily distracted, their sleep patterns might be disrupted, and you could imagine that in a school setting, that those sorts of consequences would have effects. And research supports that. Again, this comes from related literature, but children suffering from severe recurrent fatigue are more likely to do poorly in school. They're more likely to have to repeat a grade. They're more likely to miss school for issues other than whatever their health. They're not missing school because they're going and getting cancer treatment. They're missing school for fatigue-related issues. Well, they might be doing both, but they're more likely to miss school due to fatigue-related issues than children who are not suffering from fatigue. And these things all add together to have a potentially have a negative impact on the child's quality of life. So why do we get fatigued in general, and what makes children with hearing loss at risk for fatigue? And there's a lot of models of fatigue that try to explain what fatigue is and why it's present in individuals. But one that we think that is very relevant to the fatigue experienced by people with hearing loss is referred to as the motivation control theory of cognitive fatigue. And it was developed by Robert Hockey. And this model of fatigue treats fatigue as it's a subjective state, a mood state, but it serves an adaptive goal-directed function. And what we mean by that is that fatigue is this experience that we will feel or will occur with us that will force us to reevaluate what we're doing, to make sure that if we're applying effort towards some task, we want to do something, we're applying effort towards it, that the reward we're going to get from completing that task is worth the effort. For example, you're the man pushing the boulder up the hill, right? You're having to apply a lot of effort to get that boulder up the hill, and you're pushing it and you're struggling. And as you're doing that, as you're struggling to get that boulder up the hill, it is very likely that fatigue will start to develop. Now, it might start off small, and you could think of it as a little bit like a slap in the face. It's going to force you to answer the question, do I really want to get that boulder up to the top of the hill? And if I say to myself, yes, it's really important for me to get that boulder up to the top of the hill, I'm going to continue to apply effort to try to achieve that task. But if I don't get it, if I'm not successful, if I have continuing to apply that effort but not reaching my goal, the fatigue will increase. It might get a little more uncomfortable. It might be a harder slap in the face and say, now listen, I'm asking you again, are you really sure you want to keep doing that? And the process is cyclical. The fatigue will continue to increase until I achieve my goal, or I change my behavior and decide on trying to achieve a different goal. Okay. So in that sense, fatigue serves a function like a protective mechanism to ensure that we don't apply effort unproductively. So I mentioned earlier, there's lots of things that can impact the development of fatigue and its severity, one of them being the amount of effort that's applied, whether it be mental or physical. This is especially true if the effort that you're applying, despite applying effort towards something, you're struggling to achieve that goal. So high levels of effort are going to increase your risk of fatigue. That's one factor. Another factor that plays a role is control. And in the title, motivational control theory of fatigue, it turns out control is quite important. And the example I use here is the assembly line worker whose job it is to put widgets in a box. And they are coming down the assembly line at kind of a rapid rate. And if the assembly line worker provides a lot of effort, they can keep up with that pace. Okay. But only for so long. And they have limited control over slowing that assembly line down, right? So that combination of high levels of effort required and limited control over your ability to modify that effort in the task, that's going to increase our risk for fatigue. And then the last component that I'm going to highlight, and there are others, but these are primary ones, is the importance of the conditions that you're in. How motivated are you to achieve your goal? And the goal we'll be talking about today is successful communication. You know, how badly do you want to understand what that person is saying, or how badly do you want to get the boulder up the hill? It's similar. When we're highly motivated, we're more likely to put more effort towards a task. And so more effort due to the high motivation will increase our risk for fatigue, particularly if there are negative consequences if we don't achieve that goal. So, for example, for the assembly line worker, if they can't keep up that pace, they may lose their job. There are negative consequences if they're unsuccessful, and that increases risk for fatigue in those conditions. So now I want us to step back a little bit and think about how this might apply to a child with hearing loss. Why would children with hearing loss be at increased risk for fatigue? So if we think about the effort realm, there's been increasing effort over the past decades that make clear that when an adult or a child has hearing loss, then it's very common that they need to apply more mental effort towards listening tasks than age-matched peers without hearing loss. So if all other things are equal, the child with hearing loss is going to be more at risk for developing fatigue, if for no other reason that they're more likely to have to apply more effort to achieve their goal. But also think of children in school settings. How much control do they have? Right? They have relatively little control. The child with hearing loss may be applying a lot of effort, but still struggling to hear the teacher. You may want the teacher to turn off the noisy background or to move closer to them, but they don't have the control to make those things happen. Right? So that's sort of outside of their realm. That's going to increase their risk for developing fatigue. And then finally, when children are in academic or social settings, particularly children with hearing loss, and they want to understand speech, it's important to them to do that because they get reward for that, right? If they and there are negative consequences if they don't. They want to do well in school, they don't want to fail or have to repeat a grade. But you could imagine just in a social setting, there are negative consequences for not achieving that goal of successful communication. The child misunderstands a peer or the teacher. They may feel embarrassed or frustrated. So there are consequences for that. All of those things work together to make our hypothesis be that children with hearing loss would have an increased risk for fatigue. And so if we think that's the case, can we demonstrate that empirically? Can we measure it? Are there tools? And in fact, there are pediatric fatigue scales. There's not a lot of them, but there are some, and I've listed several here. The top one, the Pediatric Quality of Life Multidimensional Fatigue Scale, referred to as the PEDS-QL. That is a generic fatigue scale. It's been around for a long time, well validated, used. When I say generic, it's designed to be used with large, diverse populations. So people have used this to study hearing loss. We've used it in our lab to study hearing loss. Others have used it to study cancer, diabetes, and others. The Childhood Fatigue Scale is a disease-specific measure. It was specifically designed to assess fatigue associated with cancer in children. So you can see both kinds. Okay? But none of these that I've listed here were specifically designed to measure fatigue associated with listening difficulties that we think children with hearing loss are at risk for. But they have been used. Some of them have been used to look at fatigue in children with hearing loss. So can we use those results to support our idea that kids with hearing loss are at risk? So is fatigue a problem for children with hearing loss? And the answer is yes. And I'm not going to show you lots of different studies that show that, but I'll highlight one that used the PEDS-QL and compared the results in children with hearing loss to children who had other chronic health conditions. And that's what you see on the x-axis are all the different health conditions, cancer, obesity, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and others. The PEDS-QL is a quality of life type measure, so it's a little unusual on the surface in that low values mean low quality of life, so low is bad. So in this case, more fatigue is a lower number. And the filled black circle here under the children with hearing loss, that's data from our study. It was 60 kids with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. And so that solid line there is showing their mean score. So any symbols which are for the other studies that are below that line reported more fatigue. The others, as you can see, they're all above the line. The asterisks show studies where the fatigue is significantly less than that in our sample of children with hearing loss. So my point from this is not to suggest that hearing loss is a more serious disease than cancer. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that these other chronic health conditions for which fatigue is a primary complaint, the fatigue experienced by children with those conditions is similar to or less than, in most cases, the fatigue experienced by children with hearing loss. So the point being that fatigue certainly can be a problem for children with hearing loss. And there are other data that have come out that support this conclusion as well. So we've used these generic scales to look at fatigue in children with hearing loss and are able to show some effects, as I showed you on the prior slide. But there were things that also came up in these studies that were a little unusual initially. One thing was we didn't see the relationship between degree of hearing loss and fatigue that we expected. And it's the sort of straightforward, simple assumption is that as you have more hearing loss, you'll have more challenges listening, hence you would need to apply more effort, and we would expect your fatigue to increase. So that's what I'm showing you here. These are data from our 2017 study that used the PedsQL in 60 kids with hearing loss, and we're showing their better ear pure tone average. We looked at lots of different worse ear pure tone average, different frequencies, didn't matter. And then their fatigue scale. So we would expect this fatigue to increase, that it'd be lower in value as PTA increase, but we just don't see that at all. And so that's a little counterintuitive, but in fact, we'd seen similar things in prior work we'd done in adults using a different generic fatigue scale. This MFSI is another generic measure appropriate for adults. Here, higher values reflect more fatigue. And again, PTA on the x-axis, we're expecting this correlation that as degree of hearing loss increases, fatigue would increase, but we just don't see that at all. So that's a little bit of a flag to us about whether or not these generic measures are optimal for measuring precisely the fatigue experienced by someone who's struggling with listening difficulties. And we think the answer is that they are not. And there's some data to support that. So this is a study that we did a few years ago. It's a very small study, and actually its purpose was to look at cortisol levels as a proxy for fatigue in a small sample of college-age students who had significant hearing loss, and then normal hearing peers that were in the same programs they were. And this is interesting for us as audiologists, or for me as an audiologist, is that the population were AUD students who had severe to profound hearing loss. So these were recruited from around the country. There was 8 of them, 7 wore cochlear implants, and 1 had bilateral hearing aids. And then those students recruited their classmates, one of their classmates, to be their peer, their age-matched peer. So they're going through the same experiences. So the study looked at lots of things, but I'm going to talk to you just about the subjective data. So we used a generic fatigue scale, a generic instrument called the Profile of Mood States that looks at lots of different moods, but 2 that were relevant to us were fatigue and vigor. So we expected our hearing loss group to show more fatigue and less vigor than the normal hearing peers. So the normal hearing group is the black bars, the gray bars are the hearing loss group, fatigue here on the left, and vigor on the right. And we just didn't see that. There was no significant difference between groups. And in fact, the trend was the normal hearing group had more fatigue and less vigor than the hearing loss group. Right? So the measure was not sensitive in the way that we expected. But if we asked questions differently, if we asked questions that targeted listening difficulties and how they related to fatigue, we found consistent, strong, robust differences between groups. So this was our first attempt at sort of developing test items that might be useful on a scale. So this is literally some researchers sitting around kind of making stuff up in terms of what we think makes sense to use. It's a small study and some pilot data. So we had 3 items. Difficulty listening causes me to become physically or emotionally tired. Second one, fatigue and low energy due to difficulty listening are major problems in my life. And then the third one, how often do you feel physically or emotionally tired due to difficulty listening? So again, the black and gray bars are normal hearing and hearing loss groups respectively. And again, we see strong, large, significant differences for all of these test items. So this, in conjunction with some other things that I've talked about already, to us suggest generic measures may not be optimal to get a precise estimate of the fatigue experienced by people who are struggling with listening difficulties, like kids with hearing loss. So that's part of our motivation for developing our own scale, the Vanderbilt fatigue scales. The ones we'll be talking about today are the pediatric versions of the Vanderbilt fatigue scales. They're designed specifically to look at listening-related fatigue in children. But we also have 2 adult scales. It says here I'm going to be showing you data, but I actually took that out to save more time for Dr. Davis later. So got some data. If we have time and people want to talk about it, I can show you that. The Vanderbilt fatigue scales. I'd love to be able to spend some time walking you through the development process. It's actually a quite detailed process, and for me, it was a real interesting learning experience, having never developed scales before. But we did follow best practices, and so I'll highlight a few of things. But if you are interested in the details, I provide the citation down here for you. The paper just came out at the end of last year, so it'll walk you through in great detail. But in order to ensure that we created a measure that was valid, sensitive, and reliable, we wanted to go through certain steps. The first step was, how do you know the scale is valid and that it's relevant to the people that you're trying to test and the issues that they're experiencing, right? That's critical, that the test items themselves be relevant to the people that you're testing. And so to do that, what we did is we held focus groups and interviews. And we asked children with hearing loss, their parents, teachers that work with kids with hearing loss, about the child's fatigue experience. What's it look like? When does it happen? Under what conditions? And we got their feedback. And we used that feedback, that information from them, to actually create test items. So we know that the items on our scales are relevant for children with hearing loss because they told us they were, right? So that's an important first step. And so the first step is you develop a whole bunch of items because you don't know which ones are going to be good or bad. So we had well over 100 for the various scales that we were developing. So 100 for each, so many hundreds of test items, way too many for a scale, right? So, but you send them out and you collect data on all of those items from hundreds of individuals, hundreds of kids, hundreds of teachers, hundreds of parents. You get that data back, and then you do sophisticated statistical analyses to identify high quality items. And again, if you're interested in the nuts and bolts, you can read the paper, but that helps us sort of whittle down the large pool of items to find items that we think are particularly sensitive. And that is what makes up the final scale. And then you do it again. You send out the final scale to additional hundreds of people, collect data with that, and confirm that the responses that you're getting, you describe their psychometric characteristics and their reliability. So we went through that process. Again, for the details, you can read the paper. Briefly, the results of that validation study that I just kind of talked about showed a couple of things. One, all of the scales that we'll be talking about had good test sensitivity. And by that, I mean they were able to identify very precisely an individual's level of fatigue that they were experiencing. So if someone had mild fatigue, the scale can identify that precisely and differentiate it from somebody else who has a little more or a little less fatigue. Or if they had severe fatigue, the same way, mild, moderate, and severe. The scales had good test-retest reliability. So we tested them week to 2 weeks apart and found that the mean differences were very, very small, and there was a strong correlation between tests, suggesting that you're getting the same information both times. And then we looked at validity a couple of different ways, some that I've already talked to you about. In terms of item development, making sure the items are valid by getting that information from the individuals we're interested in testing. But we've also shown, either in our lab and other work, has shown that the scales are sensitive to differences in fatigue in groups where we expect fatigue to differ, specifically in people with and without hearing loss. And then we also looked at the relationship between our measure and measures that we thought were getting providing similar information, like a generic fatigue scale. We compared our scores to PHQ-L scores and found that they correlated well, moderately well. They're not measuring the same thing, but they're correlated well. And the correlations were weaker for things that we thought were different. So we collected data on depression in children and looked at correlations between the fatigue scales, and they were weaker than they were for the generic measure of fatigue. So all of these things together to us suggest that the measures are sensitive, reliable, and valid. So where are we now? We've got 3 versions of the scale, and Dr. Davis is going to talk to you a little bit more about them, so I'll just mention them briefly. There's a child self-report scale, and then there's 2 proxy report scales, one that the parents can fill out. That's multidimensional. We'll give you 2 scores, a mental and physical fatigue score, and then a teacher proxy version that is unidimensional, like the child scale. So it'll give you one total fatigue score. And all of these scales assess what we call long-term listening-related fatigue. So we ask the child about the child's fatigue over the past week, not how they're feeling right now, but how they typically feel. All of the scales use a 5-point Likert frequency response format. And by that, I mean, we're asking about the child's frequency of fatigue-related issues. Do they never occur? That would be scored 0. Do they almost always occur? That would get a 4. And then there's often sometimes in between there. So you can score it a couple of ways. Again, Dr. Davis is going to talk more about this, so I'll just briefly mention one way is to just sum up all of the scores from what the nevers, the 0s, the 4s. Add them all up, you get a total summed score. We think that that approach is useful for clinicians because it's quick, it's easy to interpret. Easy to calculate. Dr. Davis will talk about interpretation, and it's been used for some research purposes. But then for those in research that are interested in getting a more precise measure of an individual's fatigue, the scales can also be used to calculate what's called item response theory scale scores, or IRT scale scores. And these are sort of weighted scores. Some items are better or more sensitive at differentiating severe and mild fatigue than others. And the IRT scale scoring allows us to take advantage of those different weights to get a better estimate of the individual's fatigue. But that requires dedicated computer software and algorithm, and it's most appropriate when you're looking at data from groups. So calculating individual scores for lots of kids or lots of parents, and then comparing differences or looking for differences within that group of data. So we don't think that's useful for clinicians or people working with kids in schools. So how might you use the scales? I'm not going to talk to you about, I'm not going to show you data, but I have some slides if you're interested that suggest that you can use these scales for research purposes. And in doing so, we've shown that with adult measures that they're sensitive to degree of hearing loss, that they're sensitive in kids to differences between unilateral and bilateral hearing loss and normal hearing peers. It can differentiate normal hearing from either unilateral or bilateral hearing loss. Sensitive to benefits from hearing aids and cochlear implants, at least in adults. So most of the research that's been done so far has focused on adults, a little bit in kids, using our scales. But the results we've seen so far suggest that the scales are useful for research purposes. But we also think that they're going to be very useful for people working directly with children on a one-on-one basis. And that's going to lead to the next part of the talk, where Dr. Davis will share with you some practical applications for how to use the scale with kids. So I'll turn it over to you, Hilary.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you to everyone who's listening. I know at the end of a long day, talking about fatigue, we kind of have to perk our brains back up to get into listening again. So thank you for participating today. I feel very fortunate that in my role at Vanderbilt, I was able to both participate in the development of the Vanderbilt fatigue scales, and then in my job as an educational audiologist, I utilize this scale daily. And so it's been really helpful to be on both sides of it. You'll hear me talk about some things we've learned along the way and some of the iterative things we're doing to refine it and make it even better. In the interest of time, I may push through some slides. We have lots of information to share with you, but I want to have time for questions. Just a review here, like Dr. Hornsby shared with us, there are 3 fatigue scales. They're available on our website. I want to make it clear that this is something that you could, after this presentation, download and use immediately, free of charge. You can Google us or find it on our website. Some people will ask if you can get a score from just utilizing one of the scales, or if you have to get them from each person, a parent, a teacher, and a child. The brief answer, and we'll get into it with the case studies, but the brief answer is no. You can use the scales independently or together. We are able to get a real holistic view of a child if we collect data from their teachers and their parents, but you can absolutely calculate a score and utilize the information that you receive just from one scale at a time. As we're talking to a wide audience today, it's also important to note that I use the English version of our scale, which was the original one that was created, but there are other languages available and in progress. So if you check back on our website, there's ongoing work to translate the scale, so there may be something upcoming that would be of interest to you, depending on where you are. You heard Ben talking a lot about the generic measures, the generic questionnaires, and how we really focused on listening and understanding in the development of the VFS questionnaires. I just highlighted here, giving you some examples. This is the child version, and you can see the questions really focus on what is happening when a child's in a noisy place, when they're listening at school, or when multiple people are talking. Similarly, the parent version includes the word listening or difficulty with hearing. And again, with the teacher version, we're adding in that component of listening so that we are really targeting difficulties that deaf and hard of hearing students may be facing. My whole goal with this presentation, and especially as a clinician or an educational audiologist, is really giving you some practical tools for utilizing this scale. I think Dr. Hornsby did a great job of explaining why we care about fatigue in this population and why we'd want to identify who may be struggling. So first and foremost, when would you use this tool? We want to use it as an identification tool. Who is most at risk for a significant problem that may warrant some additional counseling or some intervention? So for me, this might mean I'm in a school and a teacher says, this child seems really worn out. That might be a time that I use the scale. Or maybe you're in a clinic setting and also a parent brings this topic up to you. Similarly, I do utilize the results that I receive and the interview that I do with the child to teach people more about fatigue in this population. As Dr. Hornsby stated, this is a newer area of research compared to some other chronic conditions that struggle with fatigue. And I really like to use the information I have from this scale to talk to educational teams, parents, the student themselves, to get a better idea of how this may be impacting their student. If you were going to utilize the scale, again, you can use 1, 2, or 3 in order to get some data. You're going to have a parent, a caregiver who knows the child best outside of the school day to complete the parent version. Similarly, for the teacher version, we want someone who has direct knowledge of the student's behaviors at school. Typically, that's their classroom teacher, their general education teacher, but there may be another service provider or educator who has a good understanding of the child's function that would be best suited to fill this out. Oftentimes, I'm finding from my colleagues, speech language pathologists, the educational audiologists, and teachers of the deaf, that we're utilizing this scale by passing it along to someone else, but incorporating that information into our reports and findings that we present at team meetings. Of course, adults are typically most often able to fill out the scale on their own, to understand the questions and the topic and provide good information. So that means that I will give a paper copy to an individual, email the fillable PDF version that we have directly to them, and allow them to complete that on their own time. A little bit of a change would be with the child version. In our user guide, it says that children between the ages of 6 to 17 can complete the scale, and we did do data collection on children within that age range. However, as I've used the scale more and gotten feedback from colleagues as well, I really recommend probably utilizing it with children around the age of 11 or up. I find that they're best able to give me results and that they're most likely to give to have a better understanding of this topic. I would say that I still assist children with this data collection. That is, I don't just hand them this paper and let them fill it out on their own. I'm really walking through it, and we'll highlight that in the case studies that we share today. It's also important to note, I've had some questions about this in the past as well. Our scales were developed for those who utilize listening and spoken language, and so it's best suited for that population. Like any test that you might be doing with a deaf or hard of hearing student, you're going to want to do this in a quiet setting, free from distractions as much as possible, and that you're checking their technology before you get started. It's important to note, if you want to calculate a summed score, you can't skip any questions and you can't choose more than one answer. So sometimes I'll get one and it'll have a 2 and a 3 circled. We really have to pick one or the other in order to make meaning from that. This is probably the most important part for me that I would want to share with you when you're using this day-to-day in clinics or in schools is that it is very important to check for understanding. As I've worked more with students, I'm just recognizing who may understand the concept of fatigue already and those who don't. So when I pull out the VFSC, I'm reading the instructions aloud to the student, reviewing the concept of fatigue, as well as the response options, that never to almost always, just to get a sense for if the child is able to participate with me in this way. The reason I bring this up is because early on in our data collection, I asked a student, what does fatigue mean to you? And she said, fatigue sounds like phantom, so maybe a squid. It was at that point that I realized, okay, for some students, we're really going to have to talk about this concept before we just launch into this questionnaire together. I'd also recommend don't be afraid to discontinue use if needed. Of course, if you can educate or ensure that the child is understanding, move forward. But if not, if they're not able to answer your probing questions, if they're answering the same answer choice all throughout the questionnaire, or if they just don't seem to understand, it's okay to discontinue. You can still get great information from the teacher and or the parent. Dr. Hornsby's already gone over this. The thing I want to highlight here is that I do utilize the sum scoring method in my practice. The tricky thing we have encountered and the feedback we've received is, great, we have a high score, but really what's the impact? And we're going to go through that in some of the case studies next. I included this slide in case you're already familiar with our fatigue questionnaires, our website, or if you've downloaded anything from our site. Currently, our interpretation and scoring section on the back of the questionnaires in the user guide uses a cutoff score with standard deviations as shown here in this graph. We weren't sure, like I said, functionally, we weren't sure what the cutoff scores would mean in terms of who would need follow-up versus specific intervention. And so we feel like this is a starting place, but may not tell the whole story. And I'll explain that as we go along. This is an example where an individual filled this out, a child filled this out, and their sum score totaled 20. If we go back to that scale, that's in the low fatigue or infrequent problem based on the chart there. The tricky thing here is if we really get into the weeds of what this questionnaire response looks like, the child has indicated 3 different questions highlighted here where an issue is occurring frequently, often or almost always. Feeling stressed at school, giving up when trying to listen, and feeling worn out when there's attentive listening or careful listening required. Because of that, what I've started to do and what I would recommend at this time while we're reviewing how to best make meaning of some of these scores is ask probing questions. When a child has that high score on an individual question, even if their sum score is low, there could still be a potential issue that they're facing, and there might be something that we're able to intervene on their behalf. So what this might look like is saying, tell me more about when this happens to you or what's going on that makes you feel stressed. We're going to show some examples in the case studies as well. This is the first case study. This is a student that is seen by our outreach team here at Vanderbilt for deaf education services. I coordinate with her deaf educator, and she utilizes hearing aids and a remote microphone system at school. Her parent had reached out because they had some concerns for academic progress. 7th grade was really tricky, and they were just feeling like something was kind of missing. In this particular instance, I interviewed the family over Zoom. The parent completed their portion, and the parent score was a mental score of 18 and a physical score of 10, which are both in the low range. Then I also did the VFSC, walking through that with the student. What I'm going to show you on the next slide is actually an excerpt. I wanted to show you how I talked to the student, both giving them instructions, reading through the questions, and asking some probing questions to kind of put together everything we've talked about thus far. So let's read these instructions together. Sometimes people feel tired from listening and trying to understand. We would like to know how you feel listening in different places. We're going to read each sentence, and I want you to tell me the answer that describes how you often feel or act in a typical week. We're not going to skip any questions, okay? So we'll look through these questions together here. And then your answer choices for each question are never, rarely, sometimes, often, or almost always.
Okay. Do you want me to answer that? Okay.
Yeah, well, let's talk through. Do you have any questions about what these answer choices mean?
No.
Okay. All right, let's go to the first one. I want to zone out in very noisy places.
Sometimes.
Okay. What does that mean to you, zone out?
Well, like, if it's like really loud and I'm trying to listen and I'm trying to listen to other people talk to me and it's kind of like so background noise is so loud and they're just like talking to me in a normal voice, it gets kind of chaotic to me. And then sometimes I'll just want to zone out, but yeah.
What do you do if you zone out? What does that mean?
Probably just not focus, not hear, or maybe I'll hear, but I just don't respond.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. It is hard for me to concentrate when lots of people are talking.
Honestly, sometimes.
Okay. Can you give me an example?
Is yeah. Well, if there's like a test and the teacher's not like telling us to be quiet or something, which she usually does, but like if they're not, or if people are talking, then I mean sometimes it'll be kind of loud and like hard to concentrate, but I feel like it doesn't happen often.
Okay. My brain gets tired after listening all day.
I would say yes. I would say almost always, probably. Yeah.
Okay. Can you give me an example of when that might happen or what it feels like to you that you're saying your brain gets tired?
I'm just like, my brain is so tired. I have like, sometimes I'll start to get a headache. And I've been listening all day and just focusing all day. And I just want to like sit down and rest or something.
Mm-hmm. What kind of day is that where that happens?
Like definitely a school day. I guess like if I'm busy with like, I have a lot of classes and that all of it is like teaching and teaching and teaching, which just kind of can make me really tired.
Got it. I apologize if the video quality got a little off there, but hopefully you were able to get the gist of what that looked like in real time. So it was an exchange of utilizing the questions on the VFSC in tandem with some good qualitative data from that student. What I normally do when I'm administering a questionnaire like that, and just so you know, we did go through the entire questionnaire. It took me about 15 minutes. I will take notes and use that in my report or when I'm emailing teachers in addition to the summed score. And one thing that was really interesting about Louisa is that her deaf education teacher, I sent everything to her, and she said in response, this totally changed the perspective of her teachers and tutors. She said, I did a training about fatigue at the beginning of the year, but it wasn't until they read her words that it had the impact that it did. And in this case, they did actually consider some interventions that might help support this student in the classroom setting. I'm looking at time. And so I'm going to briefly go through Malik, a second case study, and then we'll kind of wrap up so that we can have some time for question and answer. This student is not based in the US. This came from one of my colleagues who's a deaf educator in another country. And she sent me this one because this child had some score of 29 on this one standard deviation of a mean in terms of our scoring here. You can see there are tons of questions in which he answered often or almost always. I wasn't able to interview this student. I just received their results here. I really wanted to talk about the teacher responses here, because you can see that this teacher, there aren't any always, there's some often, but this really highlights the student that really may be pushing through or doing well in terms of getting tired, getting worn out, but on the outside, not really showing much impact. So some qualitative information from that teacher. She said, really, I think this score really shows that he's working overtime to hear everything I say. She said, what I'm realizing in his low score is that it reflects he's always persistent and he does not always complain. She had already independently said, I'm helping him find a space where he can take listening breaks. So those are just two case studies briefly to highlight that utilizing that information, both qualitative or notes from teachers or students or parents in combination with the questions, can really get the conversation started, and we can really work together to figure out what needs to happen next. I'm going to go ahead and say, I would love to say, once you have this data, we have an exact game plan of what happens next. Unfortunately, we don't. These next slides just go over some brief strategies that you could utilize to help students. These are strategies that were presented in the focus groups and interviews that we completed at the beginning of our data collection, and really highlight things that children, parents, and their teachers can do. We're going to go ahead and go to the end here. And these slides, if you'd like them, you can reach out to me and I can get you some of this information. There's also a management document on our website that could be helpful for you in that regard. I would just in summary say, in terms of what could you do tomorrow when you go back to work or the next day, utilize the VFS, use probing questions, get that conversation started. You can use this as an identification and a counseling tool. And really, I'm hopeful that this is something that's helpful. If you utilize it and have any questions or feedback, I would love to hear it. And you can email me, can put my email out and let you guys have that information. But for now, I think we will move to some questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hornsby and Dr. Davis. That was fabulous and fascinating seminar on fatigue, and something that resonates deeply with me. And we've got lots and lots of questions for you all. I got a couple of questions in the chat that I will bring up first. The first one is, and I think this is probably directed to you, Dr. Hornsby, with the FBS PEDS, was there a variation regarding the degree of hearing loss and fatigue?
Yeah, thank you. So to be honest, at this point, that data hasn't been, there's not data that can show that. For adults, we have some data that shows that the adult scale is sensitive to variations in degree of self-reported hearing loss. That is, if someone self-reports, I have a mild, moderate, severe, or profound loss. And if we look at correlations between degree of hearing loss, like pure tone average and fatigue scores, we do see a significant correlation in adults, but it is quite weak. So if you may recall, the first scales I showed you with the generic measures, the correlation was not significant. So using our scale, it's more sensitive to degree of hearing loss, but it highlights that degree of hearing loss isn't necessarily the driving factor that leads to the variations in fatigue, in at least in adults. So we don't have data yet on that in kids. Much of the work we have done with kids has been during the development of the scales. So we need to get responses from hundreds of people. And so you don't do that in a clinic, having people fill it out one at a time. You do that by sending out surveys online. And from those responses, we don't always have audiograms to look at that. So that's work that still needs to be done. I would not be surprised if we saw a correlation. However, I would expect it to be weak.
Yeah, maybe if I could make a suggestion, maybe it's not the degree of hearing loss, but the degree of difficulty in listening. Because that can vary no matter what the degree of hearing loss is.
No, absolutely. The strongest correlation with our fatigue scores is perceived hearing difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
We have that in adults. We don't have a measure like that in kids that we were able to use, but in adults, it suggests to me that fatigue is a component of those life hearing difficulties.
Right, excellent. So a few more questions coming up here now. So the information presented today mostly focused on school-age children. This person posing the question wonders about how to guide and coach parents of children who are beginning to use hearing technology and who are between 12 months and 3 or 4 years of age and possibly attending childcare at the same time. Do you have how would you coach parents of infants and young children?
Yeah, I think Hilary is best suited to talk about that.
I'm happy to chat about it and just say that it is something that I still bring up to parents. Unfortunately, we don't have research or we don't have babies telling us how they feel, right? And this is something that we've struggled with in terms of what and how we share with them. But we do let families know even early on, this is something that your child may struggle with. We just aren't able to get that qualitative data with our questionnaire until the child is older. And really, a lot of our questions are based on active listening during learning that is associated with school-age children.
Okay, great. So this kind of leads into the next question is that some of the children want to remove their technology as soon as they come home from school. And of course, we tend to coach that we should be using technology for all waking hours, but maybe perhaps we should be allowing a break in some context if we see older children reporting that they need these breaks. What are your thoughts?
Go ahead, Hilary.
Okay. Absolutely. In our focus groups, our interviews and clinical practices, this is so commonly reported, and parents and professionals are both very nervous about that because of the audiological recommendation and from those doing SLP or TOD services as well. I have, with a good plan, talked to families or schools about listening breaks. I see another question in the chat that says, how long should the listening break be? I think this does go back to the need for individualized considerations for a student. Some children are able to self-manage and say, yep, I'm going to my room for 30 minutes. I'm taking off my CIs. See you afterwards. Others need some coaching and guidance, and that can change over time as well. It's part of that self-advocacy building that I do during school times as well when talking to students. But I do think that it is something that can be implemented for some students.
Okay, and so this is something that you did bring up, Hilary, is that sometimes you see a mismatch between teacher-parent responses and child responses. What do you make of that? I know you discussed it a little bit, but can you re-emphasize what those differences mean?
And you can talk about this too.
So I can tell you that there's a large literature in other related fields as well that suggests that parents and kids don't always agree, and certainly teachers don't. And that comes in part because they come at it from different perspectives. So we expect in many cases there to be some agreement, but as in the example that Hilary provided, sometimes they're different, right? So the child was aware of their fatigue, even though it wasn't visibly present to the teacher. So our current opinion about that is that's one of the advantages of using all three scales. And if anyone suggests that there's a problem, then that's a valid concern and something that should be followed up on through, as Hilary was saying, through further interviews and probing to figure out what's the best response to that. And Hilary, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, that's what I was going to say. I think that's exactly right. I take some variation in the responses with a grain of salt and do some additional probing for sure.
And so we must end the questions here because we must finish on time. There are many more questions in the chat, and I think Hilary and Ben can see those. So I must remind everyone that to complete their assessment of learning. And for those of you who want to collect CEUs, to go ahead and fill out those forms for this particular presentation. And thank you, Dr. Hornsby and Dr. Davis, for a fabulous presentation. And I'll be recommending this to my colleagues